Edda produced a bundle from under her cloak, the ledger wrapped in a scrap of coarse cloth, edges browned with smoke. Even in the dark, the paper had a smell, charred corners, faint chemical tang of iron gall and tobacco, the scent of rooms where secrets had been kept too long. Matthias placed the package on the table as if it were a relic. His fingers trembled so slightly he thought he felt the ink move along his skin. Sister Anwen unfolded the cloth with reverence rather than ceremony. Her nails were blunt and ink slimed at the edges. She paled and wiped them on her veil. She did not open the ledger at once. Instead, she produced from a shelf a long glass rod and dipped it into the lamp to steady the flame's throat, an old habit of scholars who hated the vagaries of shadow. "We must be careful with light," she said. "Light will eat the words if we are thoughtless. And light is watched." There was something in the way she said watched that made the hairs at the nape of Matthias's neck stand up. She opened the ledger with cautious tenderness as if kneading dough. The pages sighed soft, papery, the sound of time exhaling. The script within was neat, almost bureaucratic, columns of names, dates, small notations of payments. The ledger's handwriting was not the spidery scratch of some desperate rebel, but the clean, procedural hand of an administrator who made human loss into entries. Now the ledger seemed more than a list. It was a ledger of decisions. Beside some names were small cross marks and sums. Beside others, nothing. Matthias's throat tightened. This came from where? Sister Anwen asked, not lifting her eyes. Edda told the story in chess moves, a misfiled bundle, a clerk's absent-minded placement. A night when the scriptorium smelled of coffee and sweat and the wrong stack slid beneath the wrong shelf. She left out the embarrassment Matthias felt at being the man who had found it, and instead spoke like someone offering a patient diagnosis. "It belongs where it is not kept. We must see if the ledger speaks true." She had the habit of making everything sound like a question rather than a provocation. Sister Anwen nodded and turned to another folio she had already brought forward, smaller, brittle, covered with cramped script. She coaxed open the folio and laid it beside the ledger like two bodies that might hold a conversation. The folio's writing was older, the ink browned to the color of autumn leaves. It was a series of oaths, formal, cadenced, each with the names of small households and the marks of men who could not sign. Many oaths had been offered in extremity to protect a miller's family, to keep a widow's small field from confiscation. Each oath bore the same ritual language, pledges made in the name of survival, petitions for mercy in exchange for service. Sister Anwen ran her finger gently along the margin and read aloud in a voice that made the chapel keep still. The words were curved and deliberate, by hearth and kin, for the safeguard of household and seed, we bind our names to the quartermaster's ledger, to hand those who would bring ruin into his keeping, that others may stand. The phrasing was archaic on the tongue, the cadence of a legal formula, but to Matthias it read exactly like the ledger's entry, a line that, in ink, said trade and barter rather than oath and salvation. In the ledger the payments sat like receipts beside names, a price for forgetting, perhaps. Matthias's eyes stung. He felt as if the words themselves had weight and were pushing inward on his chest. The phrase "hand those who would bring ruin into his keeping" struck with the clarity of iron. He imagined the rituality of signing, a trembling hand, the rubbing of a thumb across damp ink, the desperate attempt to keep the hearth. He thought of his mother's stories, the sanitized lullabies of survival. The line about prudent choices his father had offered at festivals, and he saw how those phrases were veneered over something harder. The ledger's bureaucratic calm had been an instrument. The folio's oath was its justification. The room was small enough for breath to be a shared resource. Edda watched him, the candlelight sharpening the planes of her face. The convent windows were narrow. Outside, the town's noise was reduced to a distant, sullen drone. Sister Anwen's finger moved along the line again, and as if it were necessary to make the fact more present, she underlined a word with a stub of bone. They offered names, she said simply. That is what the words mean in practice. The ledger records what the oath performs. One is promise, the other is payment. Her voice betrayed no judgment, only a cataloger's recognition that the language fit into a pattern the world made. Why keep such things? Matthias asked, the question raw as a wound. His ears felt full of the word why, as if the convent had never been asked a question that might blemish its peace. Why not burn them? Why hold testament to such bargains? Sister Anwen's eyes moved like a clock. Because forgetting is an act that belongs to those who fear the present, she said. We keep them because forgetting does not remove the hurt from those who remember. What you call shame, others call proof. When the state tells a story that is whole, there is no room for the names of those who did not survive. We keep them at the risk of our house, because the dead deserve to be lodged somewhere besides the mouths of those who might profit from their silence. The finality of what she said steadied itself in the room and resisted the thinness of Matthias's excuses. He wanted, for a moment, to speak as he had been trained to speak, to analyze, to step back and weigh facts with the coolness of a clerk. But knowledge had a temperature now, heat like embers that flared at the touch. He felt, with a sick clarity, the shape of his family's survival. The ledger and the oath together painted a transaction in human terms, names exchanged for the continued breathing of faces he knew. He had grown up among those faces. They had fed him, scolded him, taught him the careful art of folding documents as if they were flowers. The idea that their comfort might have been bought with the hushed disappearance of others was a sudden and intimate violence. Edda folded her hands and then unfolded them as if she sought the right word. We must know provenance, she said finally. We must be certain this folio and that ledger speak to one another not by accident, but by ancestry. The handwriting, the ink, Sister Anwen can help us with all this. But certainty will make us dangerous. Are you certain you want to know? She used the word like a scale. Matthias felt the ledger on the table like a small, obstinate heart. To be certain would require movement, copying, corroboration, perhaps passing the folios to others less exposed than he. To know fully meant that his hands could no longer be neutral. I must, he said. The truth of the sentence surprised him. It came out small and inevitable, like the final piece of a puzzle, saying it made the world tilt a degree. I must know. Sister Anwen's mouth twitched no laugh, but an acceptance that the hour had chosen them. She fetched thin strips of paper from a drawer and some powdered ingredients that scholars used to test ink. She worked with methodical speed, placing a small sliver beneath the folio and lifting its edge to show the watermark. This paper, she murmured, comes from a mill north of the city, not where the scriptorium buys. And the ink composition, she tasted a minute of it, with a learned grimace as if the act were a sacrament of inquiry. The iron content is high and the gall suggests a quick brew. Soldier's ink, not a clerk's slow brew. The hand on the ledger is administrative, yes, but the entries were made in a period of displacement. The oath's language is older, but the phrasing moved into official use when bargainings were common. These two could be sibling pages of the same moment. She tapped the table, not sibling by accident, sibling by design. Matthias listened and felt the web tighten. The instruments she used, the bone ruler, the slender glass tip, the slivers of paper, were not the tools of conspiracy but of exactness. Such evidence would be hard to deny without producing a ferocious gasping of words from the palace. Forgeries, planted papers, insurgent misinformation. Yet the ledger and the oath together made a simple proposition difficult to ignore, that a formal, ceremonial exchange of names for security had occurred. The practicalities of what might follow rolled through him in the cold logic of a clerk. Proof required copies. Copies meant hands other than his would know. Hands meant risk. Risk meant exposure for the convent and Edda's quiet life in the archives and, worse, for his family whose precarious peace was held together by the smallest of social threads. He imagined his mother's face, when the city turned from her and his brothers insulted in the square. He imagined being hauled from the scriptorium and asked to admit mistakes in official documents while the chancellor's men wrote the lie to save the state's sanctity. The ledger on the table became not a clue but a crucible. Outside, someone set down a bucket. The sound was ordinary water clinking against wood, but within it was the reminder that the city continued to move. As if oblivious, Sister Anwen glanced at the narrow window and then back to the folio. "We can make a careful transcription," she said quietly. "If your hand touches the original too often, they will notice. If other hands touch it, they will be accounted for in the registers. We must be surgical. Whoever stole safety with a pen cannot be allowed to think safety can be kept by silence alone." She paused and added, with the small edge of humor that made her human, "I have been hiding names for years. They have not grown dull. They require tending like a garden. If you are willing to tend, we will teach you how." Matthias caught at the offer like a drowning man at a plank. Part of him recoiled. The scriptorium had rules, and his mentor Galen, frightened into conservatism by the need to keep the peace, had warned him of the price of curiosity. But that voice was growing small beside the images the folio produced. The faces in his childhood suddenly reorganized into a ledger of obligations. The tangibility of the oath was a rupture to the narrative of orderly survival. He pictured the dates and sums in the ledger, he had seen them, and the horrid simplicity of numbers tied to human names. The moral arithmetic of his life no longer balanced. They worked through the night. Sister Anwen's method was gentle and fast. She taught him how to handle the edges, how to lift a corner with a glover's glove, how to catch breath and not let it fall on the page like a small, corrosive rain. When it came to copying, she insisted he do the initial incisions, a small transcription that carried with it the ring of eye-witnessing. "You will be accountable for what you copy," she reminded him. But accountability is not the same as guilt when paired with care. She said it plainly, but with an iron core that steadied Matthias when his hand shook. At one point, as he traced the ledger's operands and the oath's clauses, a tremor in his chest grew into something that wanted to be named. He realized with a scraping force that he would not, after tonight, be able to fold any paper without thinking of what it might hide. The world of administrative comfort, columns, sums, neat margins had become a crucible for life and death. His job had been to tidy memory. He had believed that tidy memory made good government. Now he felt the ruin that tidy memory could arrange, names tucked into ledgers, lives calculated away, the state's peace assembled upon a foundation of purchased silence. Halfway through, as dusk blurred and the oil lamp guttered, they heard steps outside the chapter house door. It was a dull, heavy tread, 2 boots passing in conversation. Their voices were muffled, but near enough that Sister Anwen's hand went to the ledger without theatrics. Edda's eyes were knives. Matthias felt the floor tilt and some part of his insides lurch. They did not speak or scramble. Sister Anwen slid the folio beneath her skirts, folding her habits over it as if she were tucking a child into bed. The motion was so ordinary that for half a breath Matthias believed they were simply closing. The footsteps slowed. Hands rapped once on wood. A voice asked a simple, bureaucratic question that asked little and thereby could be answered little. A convent guard, instructed by habit, asked if anyone needed counsel. Sister Anwen answered in a voice like a bell, "All is well. Go with God." The feet moved on. When silence returned, it did not feel like relief so much as the sudden knowledge of how closely danger could touch them. They watched the convent now, Sister Anwen said, not accusing but resigned, not for piety but for pockets of memory. If the palace fears unquiet names, they will listen for the rustle of folios. We are quiet because we must be quiet, not because we wish it. Her calm held a sorrow that made Matthias think of little graves. Outside the chapter house window, the sky had moved from violet to black, and the lanterns in the courtyard were focused pins of light. The city beyond was a dark suggestion. The work of transcription grew more urgent with the knowledge of the patrol. Edda dictated the ledger's marginalia into a sliver of paper, her voice trim and low, while Matthias copied in a hand that made him feel as if he were signing himself into peril. His pen bit through the paper and left a dark line. He had to breathe carefully to keep from smudging the quickness of the ink. The letters he formed felt like pledges. He was no longer merely a clerk correcting a royal narrative. He was, if the words meant anything, a witness. When they had finished, the three of them sat together in a silence that was not empty. The folio and the ledger lay side by side like two halves of a map. The evidence was not theatrical. It had the quietness of a thing that had always existed but had been refused a public. Sister Anwen folded a corner of the transcription with the care of someone tucking a petition into the fold of a robe. "What you have discovered is a hinge," she said. "Either it opens and the house falls apart, or it opens and the house lets light in. Neither is easy, neither is painless, but it is true." There was no solace in her assessment. She had the strange, immutable conviction of those who had watched mourners and tyrants pass through the same door. Matthias's own conviction hardened. The ledger's pages, the folio's oath together, they were not an accidental conversation, but a designed chorus. His family's name, he knew without being told, would be one of those household lines that had prospered by choosing security. To bring the ledger into the world would endanger them. To hide it would be a theft from the dead. The arithmetic of conscience offered no clean solution. He had always been taught to measure wrongs like sums to be balanced. But here the sums required subtraction of comfort and addition of pain. He rose as if from a fever and took the transcription into his own hands. The paper crinkled with the small, indifferent sound of truth making itself plain. He felt both smaller and, in a way, larger. A man who had been given a thing that could not be unknown now carried it under his skin. Edda read his face and did not speak. Sister Anwen placed a small, rough hand on his sleeve, an anchor hand that steadied him more than any counsel. "Go home," she said at last. "Sleep if you can. Keep what you can and give what you must. We will keep a copy. We will teach you how to make a secure transmission. But do not think you can return to the neutral arithmetic of the clerk's life. The ledger has chosen you. The choice for you is how you will answer." Her words were not an accusation but a mandate. Matthias wrapped a transcription in cloth and placed it inside his inner tunic. The paper lay warm against his skin. He felt guilty. Yes, but not with the small guilt that had inhabited him in the scriptorium and embarrassment at discovery. This guilt was full-bodied. It named faces he had loved and clasped, and had believed were preserved by prudent choices. It named the ledger's victims, whose names the convent had kept like a litany. It also named the cost he might ask of those he loved. Being moved to knowledge had converted his life into a ledger of possibilities. They led him back across the cloister. The bell's sound was an anemic thing at this hour, a timid ticking against night. The city's lights were fewer now. The palace's distant silhouette was a dark jawline. Edda walked beside him, spare and watchful. Sister Anwen lingered at the convent gate, her figure a small, grey sentinel in lamplight. "Be careful," Edda said, and she did not say "for yourself alone." That was the shadow that sat beside him on the way home, a shadow full of potential harms. He thought of the ledger's neat columns, of the oath's archaic phrasing, and he knew the world had shifted. The scriptorium would be colder. The chancellor's men would be more vigilant. The names would no longer be only ink and paper, they were now a responsibility he bore. At the corner where they separated, Edda reached for his sleeve, only a touch, not possession, an entreaty that said, "Keep me in whatever you do." He nodded. In the pocket pressed to his chest the transcription was a small, accusing weight. That night, as Matthias lay in the small bed in his cramped room and listened to the city's distant snore, his hand went to the fabric against his breast. He pulled it free and spread the transcription across his knees. The candle beside his pallet trembled, as if agreeing with the candle in the convent. He read the oath again, as if the letters might change if he looked hard enough. The words did not change. They repeated in his head like footfalls. He wondered, in the empty hours, whether the names in the ledger had been alive and warm once, and whether any of those he loved had crossed a threshold while another doorway was locked. When the sun crested the next morning, and the scriptorium's shutters were opened to the world, he would go to his desk and correct a clean copy of the Chronicle and dip his pen in the black comfort of official ink. Yet now, under the quotidian rubbing of a clerk's life, a new ledger had begun to keep score, a tally of who knew, who kept silence, who chose to speak. The covenant he had found in the convent's brown pages had formed itself into a moral weight that would not let him sleep. Guilt, he realized with the acuity of a man who knows his sins by name, was not a single feeling but a compass pointing toward a hard exigency. The question was less, what have I discovered, than what will I do with the discovery? He closed his eyes and the faces swam his mother's gentle reprimands, his father's careful silence, the ledger's ordered rows. The city outside began to stir. He placed the transcription back against his chest like a heartbeat, and for the first time since he had unwrapped the ledger, allowed himself to imagine that this truth, carried into the light, might either wound or cure. The thought was not comforting. It was, however, honest, and for reasons he could not yet name, that honesty felt like an obligation he no longer could refuse. When he slept, he dreamed of pages fluttering like trapped birds and of names forming from ash. He woke before dawn and, in the hush, he began to plan the ways a single, quiet hand might learn to make a copy that would not betray its authors. The city had rebuilt itself from ruin once. Perhaps memory could be mended as well. But the ledger and the folio had opened a door that could not be shut. The convent had given him proof. Now it was as Arwen had said his to answer. Matthias knew the shortest way to Jasper's Lane by habit rather than map. It was a succession of judgments turn left where the plaster had been mended with paste so poorly matched the original. Then right where the cobbles sagged under the wagon that always stopped for hours outside the Coopers. At dusk the path closed around him as if a hand were drawing a sleeve. The city seemed to gather its breath and wait. The windows shuttered early here. Shop doors shut with the quick, neat movements of people who kept accounts in their heads as much as on parchment. He walked with his coat wrapped against the damp, fingers worrying the strap of the satchel that held his own small instruments and the misfiled ledger's copy, always folded and thought round in his breast. The ledger would be a story to some. To him it was a weight he could not put down. The lane where Jasper worked lay off the market like a secret rumor. Jasper's door was not a proper door, but a wooden flap hung on a hinge and secured by a length of twine. The smell that leaked out was a different kind of ink, linseed oil, the mineral tang of ground pigments, the sweet rot of soaked glue. It was the smell of things remade and things made to seem older than they were. A bell tinkled when Matthias pushed the flap. Inside, the room was low and cramped, illuminated by a single lamp whose flame made the air tremble. Shelves sagged with folded sheets of vellum, jars of iron gall ink stiffened with skins of tarnish, and a clutter of implements lay on a long table, bone folders, brass punches, knives dulled by constant use. A small pile of metal mattresses, their faces blackened and each with a different, exacting design, gleamed dully amid the clutter. Jasper sat behind the table as if grown from it, a man in whose hands the tools seemed not to be instruments, but extensions of fingers that had never known another life. Matthias Corvin, Jasper said, smiling without surprise, come to sample the forbidden fruit of my tradesman's pantry. His voice was warm and quick. There was no malice in it, but an economy of attention. At his elbow a thin boy Wren, Matthias' guest, mopped a cup with ragged cloth and watched as if witnessing something he ought to imitate. Jasper's eyes moved like a thief's, taking stock, measuring the satchel strap across Matthias' shoulder. Leave the satchel on the peg and your hat with it too. I hate things that rustle. They frighten the work, he said, and the boy pulled a peg and took the bag, setting it on a pile of scrap vellum. Matthias' mouth was dry. He had come because the ledger pressed at him. Because its names, then their payments, then the dates, the neat columns would not unglue themselves from his mind. If the city had been made on lies, then knowledge of the mechanics of lies would be useful, he thought. If a man could make a false seal that no one would doubt, then the authority of the chronicle, of every legal parchment, was less absolute than he had believed. He wanted to understand with his hands what he had suspected with his eyes. Jasper's trade promised a blunt lesson. Jasper waved him to a stool. The lamp made their faces theatrically bright against a dark background. You want to be instructed, he said. Matthias swallowed and nodded, only to learn how they do it, how a seal can be trusted when a hand can make another. Jasper's fingers closed on a cylinder of bone and a strip of wax. The movement was intimate and commonplace. He warmed the wax by the lamp flame until it softened, and then had Ren press a spoon-shaped tool into the flame to catch the drippings. The wax sizzled and the sound seemed to fill the room like an answer. There was a stagecraft to Jasper's movements. He lingered on each action as if teaching a liturgy. You watch how the wax takes heat, he said. Not too hot. If it is too hot, the wax will bloom and lose the crispness of the impression. Too cold and it cracks. Most men do not attend to such temperance. They hurry, they rush to be believed. Forgery is a patient sin. Then he took up a matrix, a small disc of copper worn at the edges. He pressed it into the warmed wax and then lifted. The impression was perfect, as if a minute coin had been struck under his hand. The room smelled of smoke and old wax, and the sharp metal tang of a dozen small secrets. There, Jasper said, turning the wax so that its shadow fell like authority across the table, a seal in the flame. Also he produced a small pot of iron gall ink and thinned it with water until it lay like oil. The ink, old men who write law use iron gall. It eats paper slowly, makes it read as if it had bled through the parchment for years. But the color C can be made by a man with the right recipe so it will look old when rubbed with dirt and candle smoke. The paper he reached under the table and brought a sheet that smelled faintly of foxed starch. We age paper by folding it, wetting it, pressing scorch to its edge. We make wormholes with a coarse needle, and for the water stain I use a cup of diluted tannin and a sliver of iron filings. Mix it wrong and everyone will see the lie. Mix it right and no one will question. Matthias watched, furious and fascinated. Each element of the lie was a craft. Each craft required patience and a hand taught to steady itself over small, exacting tasks. The scriptorium taught him the language of letter forms and spacing, but here he saw how similar those lessons were to a betrayal. Printing and counterfeiting were siblings. Both were ways to make meaning persistent. He had always believed that the chronicle's authority came from its ritual and the Empress seal. Now he saw that the seal could be borrowed, rented, worn. Jasper's hands moved to a different set of implements, a scraping tool, a file, a stone. He shaved a corner of the vellum until a faint watermark he had drawn in pencil showed like a ghost. Watermarks are what many men trust for age, he said. People do not look for the way the watermark was drawn by hand. They look for the watermark's presence and think it proof of origin. So I make one and then I press it into damp sheets and leave it to dry with a small weight. Then the sheet will bear the mark and no one will realize the mark is my hand, not the old mill's. He worked the way a teacher might craft a demonstration for attentive students. And yet underneath the theater, there was a hard practicality and industry practiced for profit in a city that prized the look of continuity over its realities. You see how easy it is, Matthew, Jasper said at last, leaning forward. He used the full name as if forming the syllables could lower a barrier. One leaf, made with charcoal and iron and the right touch of smoke, can stand up in court. One leaf can make a man absolved or condemn another. One leaf can be all the evidence needed to silence a rumor or to start one. Matthias wanted to ask whether Jasper had ever made a leaf that had ruined a